There is an old man standing on a mountain. He is 120 years old. And the text says something that stops you if you are paying attention. It says his eyes were not dim. It says his strength had not left him. 120 years. And he could still see clearly. That detail matters. Because what he is looking at matters. To the west, across the Jordan River, lies a stretch of land that this man has been moving toward for 40 years. Not moving casually, moving through desert heat and bitter water, and the sound of 2 million people who were hungry, or thirsty, or afraid, or angry, or all four at once. Moving through plagues and rebellions and the particular exhaustion of a man who has been standing between God and a broken people for so long that he can no longer remember what it felt like to stand anywhere else. He has seen things no human being has ever seen. He has heard a voice from inside a fire that did not burn. He has watched a river turn to blood. He has stood at the edge of a sea that should not have moved and watched it move. He has climbed a mountain wrapped in thunder and come back down carrying words written by something that was not a human hand. And now he is here, on this mountain, looking at the place he has been carrying other people toward his entire adult life. He will not be allowed to go there. He knows this. God told him directly. Not through a vision, not through a dream, not through the voice of another prophet. The same voice that has spoken to him more intimately than it has spoken to any other human being in recorded history, looked at this man and said, no. The man who spoke with God as a friend was denied the one thing he wanted most. That is not the story most people think they know about Moses. Most people think they know this story. The basket on the river, the burning bush, the plagues, the parting of the sea. But here is what that version leaves out. It leaves out the man. The actual man. The one who was never entirely sure he was the right person for any of this. The one who belonged to two worlds and was fully accepted by neither. The one who spent 40 years in a palace learning power. Then 40 years in a desert learning silence. Then 40 years carrying a people through a wilderness that was teaching them something they did not yet know they needed to learn. It leaves out the question underneath all of it. What does it mean to be trusted with a nation, spoken to as a friend, given a calling that reshapes the history of the world, and still be told no? This is not only the story of how Moses reached this mountain. This is the story of why the man who spoke with God as a friend, who carried a nation through the wilderness, and who gave his life to a promise, was allowed to see that promise with his own eyes, but not enter it. Settle in. We are going back. Back to a river. Back to a basket sealed against the current. Back to the first morning of a life that would never quite belong to any single world. This is the complete story of Moses. Chapter 1. The Child Between Life and Death. Before we meet Moses, we need to meet the world he was born into. Not the world of illustrations with their gentle light and figures in flowing robes standing peacefully beside a river. The actual world. The world as it existed in the era when the biblical story places the people of Israel in Egypt. Egypt in that period was not simply a powerful nation. It was the most sophisticated civilization on earth. The pyramids at Giza had already been standing for centuries before the events of Exodus began. The Nile River sustained an agricultural system so efficient it could feed not just its own population, but neighboring regions as well. Egyptian physicians were practicing medicine that would not be surpassed in the ancient world for 1,000 years. Egyptian scribes had developed systems of writing and record-keeping complex enough to manage an empire that stretched from the south into the Levant. And inside that empire, doing the labor that empires require, was a people who had come to Egypt generations earlier as guests and had stayed long enough to become something else entirely. The biblical story tells us that the descendants of Jacob, a man who had arrived in Egypt with 70 members of his household, had grown over the generations into a population so large that the Pharaoh of Moses' birth looked at them and felt something shift inside him. Not admiration, not gratitude for their labor. Fear. The text is precise about this. Pharaoh looked at the Israelites and said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we are. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase. And in the event of war, they will join our enemies and fight against us." The logic of the frightened, powerful, not the logic of evil. Exactly. Something more ordinary and more dangerous than evil. The logic of people who have something to lose and have decided that the best way to protect it is to make sure certain other people never grow strong enough to threaten them. So, Pharaoh enslaved them, put them to forced labor, set taskmasters over them to wear them down with the weight of brick and mortar and the heat of the Egyptian sun, built his cities on their backs. And the population kept growing. So Pharaoh tried something else. He called in the Hebrew midwives, 2 women named Shiphrah and Puah, and gave them an instruction that he apparently delivered without embarrassment. When you are helping the Hebrew women in labor, he told them, look at the child when it is born. If it is a daughter, let her live. If it is a son, kill him. There is something clarifying about seeing that instruction written plainly. It helps locate exactly what kind of world Moses was born into. Not a world of vague oppression or generalized unfairness. A world in which the ruler of the most powerful civilization on earth looked at a group of enslaved people and decided that the most efficient solution to the problem they represented was to kill their sons at the moment of birth. Shiphrah and Puah did not do it. The text says they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. When Pharaoh called them in and asked why the Hebrew boys were still alive, they told him that Hebrew women were not like Egyptian women. They were vigorous. By the time a midwife arrived, the baby was already born. Pharaoh believed them, or chose to believe them, and moved to his next attempt. He issued a public decree. Every Hebrew son that is born, he announced, you shall throw into the Nile. Every daughter you shall let live. Into this world, a woman named Jochebed gave birth to a son. Stop here for a moment, because what Jochebed did next is one of the most carefully considered acts in the entire biblical narrative, and it is almost always read too quickly. She hid him. For 3 months, she hid a newborn baby in a house almost certainly surrounded by other people, in a community living under a decree that required neighbors to report exactly what she was hiding. 3 months of feeding him quietly, comforting him quickly, keeping him still in the moments when stillness was the only thing standing between his life and Pharaoh's decree. Then she did something described in 2 verses that deserves far more attention than 2 verses. She got a papyrus basket. She waterproofed it with bitumen and pitch. She placed the child in it, and she put it among the reeds at the edge of the Nile. Read that again and feel the precision of it. This is not a woman throwing her child into a river in despair. This is a woman who has thought carefully about every available option and chosen the one that offered the best chance of survival. Bitumen and pitch were standard waterproofing materials. She sealed the basket against the water. She chose her location, among the reeds at the river's edge rather than the open current. She stationed the child's sister nearby, close enough to watch, far enough not to attract attention. This was not abandonment. This was a calculation made by a mother with no power, using the most sophisticated thing available to her with what little she had. She could not walk into Pharaoh's court and argue for her son's life. She could not gather an army. She could not change the decree. But she could build a boat small enough for 1 child. She could seal it against the water. She could place it where someone powerful might find it. And then she could wait. The sister whose name the text will later tell us is Miriam stood at a distance and watched to see what would happen to him. What happened was this. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. She saw the basket among the reeds. She sent her servant to bring it to her. She opened it. The baby cried. And the daughter of Pharaoh, whose father had decreed that this child should be dead, looked at him, and felt something the decree had not accounted for. The text uses a single word. She had compassion for him. Miriam stepped forward at that moment, with a clarity of mind that is remarkable given what must have been an extraordinary situation. She asked the princess a practical question. "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" The princess said yes. Miriam went and got Jochebed, the woman who had hidden her son for 3 months, who had built a sealed basket and placed it in a river, and waited with the particular stillness of a person who has done everything they can and must now trust that it is enough, was brought to the palace of the man who had ordered her son killed and hired to nurse the child she had just placed in the river. She was paid to raise her own son. Let that settle, because it is the first impossible thing in this story, and it happens before a single plague, before a single miracle of the kind we usually associate with Moses. A Hebrew slave woman outmaneuvered the most powerful man in the world, not through force and not through miracle, but through a papyrus basket sealed with pitch, a daughter standing at a careful distance, and the compassion of a princess who was not supposed to feel anything for the child of an enslaved people. The child was brought to the princess when he was old enough, and he became her son. She named him Moses. The text gives us a Hebrew meaning. She drew him out of the water. It says, Moses, drawn out, a Hebrew child with an Egyptian name, raised in an Egyptian palace, nursed by a Hebrew mother in a world that had decreed he should not exist. From the first morning of his life, Moses did not belong entirely to any single world. He existed in the space between. He was a Hebrew who would grow up speaking the language of his oppressors. He was a prince who carried in his body the blood of enslaved people. He was alive because an Egyptian princess had compassion that her father's decree had not anticipated, and because a Hebrew mother had built a better boat than Pharaoh had planned for. This is where he starts. Not with the burning bush, not with the staff that becomes a serpent, not with the thunder on the mountain, with a basket, a river, a mother who refused to let the world have the last word about her son, and a baby who was pulled from the water before he was old enough to know that he would spend the rest of his life standing between things, carrying people from one shore to another, never entirely belonging to either side. The water would find him again. It always does. In this story, but that comes later. Chapter 2. The Prince Who Knew What He Was. We do not know what Moses looked like inside the palace. We do not know which rooms he walked through in the morning, or what language he dreamed in at night, or whether the family that raised him treated him as a son or as something more complicated than a son. The biblical text skips over the first 40 years of his life in a handful of sentences, the way a biography sometimes skips the years that were ordinary, or the years whose meaning only becomes clear much later when you are looking backward from somewhere you never expected to end up. What we know is this: the author of Acts in the New Testament, looking back at Moses from a distance of more than 1,000 years, says something worth pausing over. Moses, he writes, was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was powerful in his words and deeds. All the wisdom of the Egyptians. In the ancient world, that was not a small thing. Egyptian education for the elite was serious and rigorous formation. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, law, the management of complex administrative systems, the reading and writing of multiple scripts, the history and theology of a civilization that understood itself to be the center of the known world. Moses did not receive a partial version of that education. He received the full version, the version reserved for people who would one day hold power. He was being prepared for something. The question is whether the thing he was being prepared for was the thing Egypt had in mind. Because here is what we know about Moses in those 40 years. The detail the text preserves in just a few words before his story truly begins. He knew who he was. Not who Egypt said he was, not what the palace walls implied about him. He knew the other thing. The thing that did not fit inside the education he was receiving, or the rooms he was walking through, or the name his adoptive mother had given him at the edge of the river. He knew he was a Hebrew. We are not told how he knew. Perhaps Jochebed told him in the years she nursed him, pressing her mouth close to his ear and speaking the names of his fathers in a language that was not Egyptian. Perhaps he saw something in his own face that did not match the faces around him and asked a question that someone, eventually, answered honestly. Perhaps it was the kind of knowing that lives in the body before it lives in the mind. The particular discomfort of a person who fits everywhere on the surface and belongs nowhere underneath. However, he knew, and that knowledge was not abstract. Because outside the palace walls, the people he came from were building the things he could see from inside the palace. The store cities rose on the labor of Hebrew slaves. The bricks were made with straw. And then without straw, when Pharaoh decided the Israelites were becoming too comfortable in their misery. The taskmasters were real people with real authority to beat the men and women who did not meet their quotas. The Nile that Moses had been drawn from was the same Nile that the bodies of Hebrew sons had been thrown into. He lived inside the system. He was educated by the system. He ate at the table the system set. And he knew that the system was built on the backs of his people. That kind of knowing does something to a person over time. It does not always produce immediate action. Often it produces something quieter and more corrosive. A split. The experience of moving through a world that has given you everything while knowing that what it has given you came from somewhere. That the floors you walk on were laid by hands that are not yours. That the distance between your life and the lives of the people you came from is not the natural order of things, but a construction, maintained by force, that exists because someone decided it should. Moses moved through 40 years of that doubling. He wore the clothes of the palace. He spoke the language of the palace. He learned everything the palace could teach a man about how power worked and how civilization organized itself and how an empire kept a subject population in line. He received the education that Egypt intended to make him useful to Egypt. And the whole time, underneath all of it, he knew. Then one day he went out. The text says he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. That phrase, looked on their burdens, is not passive observation. In the Hebrew, it carries the sense of seeing with full attention, of allowing what you are looking at to land on you, rather than keeping a careful distance from it. Moses went out and he allowed himself to see what was actually happening. What he saw was an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He looked this way and that. He saw no one, and he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Everything about that sequence is worth examining carefully, because it tells us something essential about who Moses is at this point in his life. He looked this way and that. He was not acting from settled moral clarity or a predetermined plan of resistance. He was acting from impulse, from something that rose up faster than thought, and then immediately checking whether anyone had seen. This is not the action of a man who has decided on a course and is executing it deliberately. This is the action of a man who has been holding something inside for a long time and suddenly could not hold it anymore. He buried the Egyptian in the sand and went back to the palace. The next day he went out again. He saw 2 Hebrew men fighting each other and tried to intervene. He said to the one in the wrong, "Why are you striking your fellow Hebrew?" And the man said something Moses was not ready to hear. "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me, as you killed the Egyptian?" People knew. In that moment, the 2 worlds Moses had been navigating his entire life collapsed toward each other in a way he could not recover from. The world of the palace, where he was protected by his position, had been breached by what he had done in the sand. And the world of the Hebrew people, which he had thought he was defending, had just rejected him. The man he had tried to protect did not see a liberator. He saw a stranger from the palace with blood on his hands and an uncertain agenda. Moses was not one of them. He had not earned that. 40 years in a palace wearing Egyptian clothes and speaking Egyptian words had put a distance between him and his people that one impulsive act of violence could not close. He was not one of them. He was not truly one of the Egyptians either. Not anymore. Pharaoh heard what Moses had done and sought to kill him. So Moses fled. That word is the right word. He did not make a strategic retreat. He did not leave with a plan. He ran from the palace that had formed him, and from the people he had failed to protect, and from the body in the sand, and from the man who had asked the question that had no good answer. Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Nobody had. Not yet. But here is the thing about Moses that this moment reveals. The thing that will matter for everything that comes after. He did not run because he was a coward. He ran because there was nowhere left to stand. He had tried to plant his feet in two worlds, and both worlds had shifted beneath him in the same morning. He was 40 years old, formed by power, educated in everything the greatest civilization on earth could teach a person, capable and connected and intelligent in the ways that 40 years of elite formation produce. And he had nothing to show for any of it. He had a body buried in the sand, a people who did not trust him, a palace he could never go back to, and a long stretch of desert between himself and wherever he was going next. He had been drawn out of the water as an infant and placed between two worlds. Now, at 40, those worlds had made their incompatibility fully visible. There was no longer a version of his life in which he could stand comfortably in both of them. He was going to have to become something new. He did not know yet what that was. He did not know that the desert he was running into was not a punishment or an ending, that it was the second classroom, that everything Egypt had given him was preparation for something Egypt had never intended to prepare him for, that the wisdom of the Egyptians was going to matter, but not in the way Egypt had planned. He ran east, into the wilderness of Midian, away from the palace and away from the brick pits and away from everything he had been and everything he had failed to become. And for the first time in his life, Moses was entirely alone, not between two worlds anymore. Outside both of them, the next chapter of his education was about to begin, and it would look nothing like the first one. Chapter 3: The Stranger at the Well. Moses sat down by a well. That is how the text describes it. He arrived in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. After 40 years in a palace and a killing in the sand and a flight through the desert, the biblical narrator gives us a man sitting down. There is something honest about that image that most retellings of this story skip past. We want Moses in motion. We want him purposeful, strategic, already moving toward the destiny we know is coming. But the text gives us a man who sat down, a man who had nowhere to go and knew it, a man who had run as far as he could run and arrived at a well in a foreign land and lowered himself onto the ground because there was nothing else to do. The well was stone. The sun was high. The air carried the particular stillness of midday in a place where shade was a privilege rather than an expectation. This was not the courtyard of a palace or the organized chaos of an Egyptian construction site. This was the edge of the world Moses had known, and beyond it was territory that had no map drawn in any language he had been taught. He sat down, and while he was sitting there, 7 daughters arrived to draw water for their father's flocks, and shepherds came and drove them away. Moses stood up. He stood up and helped the women and watered their flocks. The text does not give us his inner reasoning. It does not tell us he made a calculation or weighed the risks or thought carefully about what he might gain from intervening. He simply saw something wrong happening in front of him and stood up. This is one of the most quietly revealing moments in the entire story of Moses. He is a fugitive in a foreign land. He has no standing, no protection, no name that means anything here. He is sitting by a well with nothing. And when he sees a group of women being pushed around by a group of shepherds, he gets up and does something about it. He cannot help himself. This is the thread that runs through the moment in the sand with the Egyptian taskmaster. through the morning when he intervened between the two Hebrew men, and now here at this well in Midian. Moses sees injustice, and something in him rises before his mind has finished thinking about it. He is not yet a prophet. He is not yet a deliverer. He is not yet anything the story will eventually need him to be. But he is already this. A man who cannot watch someone being pushed around without standing up. That instinct is going to cost him greatly before this story is over. It already has. But it is also, if you are paying attention, the precise quality that makes him usable for what is coming. The daughters returned to their father Reuel, also called Jethro, and he asked them why they were home so early. They told him that an Egyptian man had helped them against the shepherds and had drawn water for them. An Egyptian man. That is how they described him. Not a Hebrew, not a fugitive from Pharaoh's court. An Egyptian man, which means that Moses, who had fled from the Egyptian world because he was too Hebrew and had been rejected by the Hebrew world because he was too Egyptian, now passed as Egyptian in Midian without even trying. He was wearing the wrong identity in every room he entered, and the identity he was wearing changed depending on who was looking at him. Jethro invited him to share a meal. Moses agreed. And then, in the way that temporary arrangements have of becoming permanent when a person has nowhere else to go, Moses stayed. He stayed with Jethro. He married one of Jethro's daughters, a woman named Zipporah. He had a son, and he named the son Gershom, which in the Hebrew means a stranger there, or a sojourner in a foreign land. Notice what Moses does with a name. He does not name his son after hope or future or promise. He names his son after his own experience of the present moment. He is in a foreign land, and he knows it, and he is honest about it in the most permanent way available to him. By pressing the truth of it into the identity of his child, his father had been a Hebrew slave. His adoptive mother had been an Egyptian princess. And now Moses, somewhere between those two worlds and belonging fully to neither, names his firstborn son after the condition of not belonging. It is worth pausing here and asking what these 40 years in Midian actually were. In most tellings of the Moses story, Midian is the intermission, the part between the real action of Egypt and the real action of the Exodus. Moses is parked there while the story waits for him to be needed again. He tends sheep. He marries. He has children. He waits. But consider what 40 years of shepherding in the Midianite wilderness actually produces in a person. Moses had been educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He knew how empires worked, how power was organized, how administrative systems managed large populations. He knew the language and the customs and the internal logic of the civilization he was going to have to confront. That knowledge was not useless. It was essential, but it was not sufficient. What Egypt could not teach him was the wilderness, the specific geography of the desert terrain surrounding Sinai, where water could be found in land that looked like it had none. How to read the ground beneath your feet. How to move large groups of animals through hostile landscape without losing them. How to survive in a place that was not designed for human comfort and did not apologize for that fact. He spent 40 years learning that, without knowing he was learning it. The man who would one day lead more than 2 million people through that same wilderness, who would need to find water in the desert and keep a massive and disorganized population alive in terrain that should have killed them, was quietly, without any divine announcement or dramatic revelation, being given the knowledge he was going to need. He was being prepared in a classroom that looked like nothing, that looked like failure, that looked like a man who had once been a prince, reduced to tending someone else's sheep in a desert at the edge of the known world. Egypt gave him the mind for leadership. Midian gave him the ground under his feet. And there is something else Midian gave him that neither Egypt nor any subsequent chapter of his life would give him again. Silence. 40 years of relative silence, of days without the pressure of an empire watching him, of mornings that did not require him to perform a version of himself that fit inside someone else's definition. of the particular freedom that comes from being so removed from the centers of power and consequence that you can simply exist without being watched or evaluated or needed or feared. We do not know what Moses thought about during those 40 years. The text does not give us his inner life in Midian. It gives us the facts. He settled. He married. He worked. He had a son he named Stranger. But I think about what a man carries into 40 years of silence, when the last thing he did before the silence began was bury a body in the sand and run. He carried the face of the Hebrew man he had tried to defend. The man who looked at him the next day and asked, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us?" He carried the sound of that question. He carried the knowledge that his instinct to help his people had not been enough. That good intentions, dressed in palace clothes, are not the same thing as genuine belonging. That you cannot deliver people who do not want to be delivered by you. He carried that, and in the silence of the Midianite wilderness, he had 40 years to sit with it, not to resolve it, not to arrive at a conclusion that made it hurt less, just to carry it honestly, the way you carry the weight of something you did that you cannot undo, in a life that kept moving forward anyway. Moses was 80 years old when the next thing happened. 80 years old. 2 full lifetimes by the standards of most people in any era. 1 lifetime in the palace. Learning power. 1 lifetime in the desert. Learning ground. A man who had been educated in the wisdom of Egypt and in the silence of Midian, who had tried to be a deliverer and failed badly enough to have to run, who had named his son after his own displacement and then watched that son grow up in the same foreign land the name described. 80 years old, and still tending sheep, still walking the same ground, still a stranger in the land where he had lived for half his life. He led the flock to the far side of the wilderness, to a mountain called Horeb, and there, in the ordinary middle of an ordinary working day, something that was not ordinary at all caught his attention. He saw a bush that was on fire. Fire in a dry wilderness was not remarkable. Scrub brush caught and burned, and the ash blew away in the wind. What made Moses stop was not the fire. It was what the fire was not doing. The bush was burning, and it was not being consumed. Moses said to himself, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. I must turn aside." That decision, to stop what he was doing and look more carefully at something that did not fit the expected pattern, is sometimes overlooked because what comes after it is so dramatic. But it deserves attention. Moses was not standing there waiting for a revelation. He was working. He had a flock to manage and ground to cover, and the ordinary demands of an ordinary day pressing on him. And he chose to stop. He chose to look. He chose to give his full attention to something that did not make sense, rather than filing it away and moving on. He turned aside, and God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." Those 2 words, "Here I am," the most complete form of availability that human language can express. Not "here I am" with qualifications. Not "here I am" if the assignment is manageable. Here I am. Whatever you are about to ask, I am in the position of someone who can be asked. He did not know yet what was coming. He did not know that the silence of 40 years was about to end, and that what replaced it would be louder and harder and more costly than anything Egypt had ever asked of him. He just turned aside. He looked. He said, "Here I am," and the fire kept burning. Chapter 4. The fire that did not burn. Do not come any closer. That is the first thing God says to Moses at the burning bush. Not, "Hello." Not, "I have been watching you." Not, "Here is your destiny." The first instruction is a boundary. Stay where you are. Take off your sandals. The ground you are standing on is holy ground. Moses hid his face. The text says he was afraid to look at God. This is the man who killed an Egyptian with his bare hands. This is the man who stood up against a group of shepherds in a foreign land without hesitation. This is the man who spent 40 years in one of the most demanding landscapes on earth and survived it. and he hid his face. Because whatever was happening inside that burning bush was something his 40 years in the palace and his 40 years in the desert had not prepared him to look at directly. What comes next is one of the most studied conversations in all of religious literature. God speaks. Moses responds. God speaks again. And in the space of that exchange, one of the most reluctant commissions in human history unfolds. God tells Moses that he has seen the suffering of the people in Egypt, that he has heard their cry, that he knows their pain, and then, with a directness that does not soften the request with preliminary reassurances, he tells Moses what is going to happen. I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses said, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? That question deserves to be heard the way Moses meant it, not as false modesty, not as a ritual expression of humility that both parties understand is just the opening move in an acceptance speech. Moses was asking a genuine question. Who am I? Think about what that question contains for this particular man at this particular moment. He is 80 years old. He has been living in Midian for 40 years. The last time he tried to help his people, one of them asked him the same question in a different tone. Who made you a ruler and judge over us? He had no answer then, and the 40 years of silence since had not produced one. He was a man with an Egyptian education and a Hebrew bloodline who had been rejected by both worlds and had spent 4 decades tending sheep in a desert. Who was he to go to Pharaoh? He was nobody. He was a stranger who had given his own son a name that meant stranger. He was a man whose primary qualification for the task being described appeared to be that he had failed at every previous version of it. God answered him, I will be with you. Moses said, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me. And they ask me, What is his name? What shall I tell them? This is the second refusal, dressed as a practical problem. If Moses had simply accepted the commission after the first exchange, the name of God would never have been asked for in this context. Moses is buying time. He is looking for the information that will allow him to say, reasonably, that this is not going to work. God answered him, I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. Moses said, What if they do not believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord did not appear to you? Third refusal. Now it is the credibility problem. Moses from Midian, arriving after 40 years away, claiming that God appeared to him in a burning bush. He is not wrong to anticipate skepticism. He would be skeptical himself. God answered him with signs. A staff that becomes a serpent. A hand that becomes leprous and then healthy again. Concrete. Visible demonstrations of authority that Moses could produce in front of the Israelites to establish that his claim was not simply the story of a desperate old man who had spent too long alone in the desert. Moses said, Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. 4 refusals now, and this one is different from the others. The first 3 were questions, requests for information, practical objections that could be addressed with practical answers. This one is a statement about himself. I cannot do this. Not because I lack authority, not because people will not believe me, not because I do not know your name, because I am the wrong kind of person. I am not built for this. Some scholars have proposed that Moses had a speech impediment of some kind. Whether that is literally true, or whether it is Moses expressing his deepest sense of inadequacy in the most concrete terms available to him, the effect is the same. He is telling God that the assignment requires a capacity he does not have. God answered him, Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now, go. and I will help you speak, and will teach you what to say." And Moses said, "Please, Lord, send someone else." 5 refusals. And that last one is worth sitting with, because it is the only one with no argument inside it. He has run out of practical objections. He has no information request left, no credibility problem left, no personal limitation left to name. He has simply reached the bottom of his resistance and said the thing underneath all the other things: "I do not want to do this. Please find someone else." The text says at that point, the anger of the Lord burned against Moses. That is a significant detail. Through 4 refusals, God had answered patiently, addressing each objection specifically, providing signs and promises and the divine name itself. But when Moses simply said, "Send someone else," something shifted. This was no longer a man expressing genuine limitation or asking for reassurance. This was a man refusing the call with nothing left to hide behind. And God was angry. But here is what God did not do. He did not withdraw the commission. He did not say, "Fine, I will find someone more willing." He did not reduce the assignment or alter the destination. He made a concession. He told Moses that Aaron, Moses' brother, could speak for him. Aaron would be his mouth. Moses would tell Aaron what to say, and Aaron would say it. The assignment was not changed. The requirement was not reduced. God simply agreed to work around the specific limitation Moses had named, without releasing Moses from the task itself. Moses accepted this arrangement and started back toward Midian to tell his father-in-law he was leaving. Notice what he said to Jethro. He did not say, "God appeared to me in a burning bush and commissioned me to lead the Israelites out of Egypt." He said he wanted to go back and check on his relatives. Even now, even after the burning bush and the divine name and 5 refusals and the anger of God and the concession about Aaron, Moses was understating what was happening to him. He was barely admitting it to himself. Jethro told him to go in peace. And Moses took his wife and his sons, put them on a donkey, and headed back to Egypt. He carried the staff of God in his hand, the ordinary shepherd's staff that had become something else when it hit the ground and moved like something alive. He was going back to the country he had fled, back toward the palace he had grown up in, and the people he had failed to help, and the language he had spoken for the first 40 years of his life. Back toward Pharaoh and toward his brother, and toward a people who had last seen him as a young man who buried an Egyptian in the sand and ran. He was 80 years old. He had a staff and a brother and a commission he had tried 5 times to decline. And he was afraid. The text does not say he was afraid in so many words, but the 5 refusals say it. The understatement to Jethro says it. The fact that he needed to be told multiple times, in multiple ways, with signs and promises and divine anger, and a concession about his own brother, before he would take a single step in the direction of Egypt, says it. Moses was afraid, and he went anyway. This is the thing about Moses that tends to get lost when we reduce him to the man with the raised staff and the parting sea. He was not brave in the way that the word brave is usually understood. The absence of fear. The natural confidence of a person who has decided the odds are in their favor. He was brave in the harder sense. He was afraid and he went anyway. He was convinced he was the wrong person and he went anyway. He had tried 5 separate times to get out of it and had run out of ways to try. And now he was walking back toward the thing he had been trying to avoid with a shepherd's staff and a borrowed voice and 40 years of silence sitting heavy on his chest. That is not the courage of a hero who is sure of himself. That is the courage of a person who has run out of excuses and decided that the fear is not a good enough reason to stay. The bush had stopped burning by the time he left. The fire that had not consumed the wood was behind him now. Somewhere in the wilderness. The only thing it had left behind was a commission he had not asked for, and a name he had never heard before, and the particular weight of a man who has said, "Here I am," and discovered too late that those words have consequences. He was going back to Egypt. Egypt, which had given him everything and cost him everything. Egypt, which thought it was through with Moses. Egypt was wrong. Chapter 5. The 10 Plagues and the Hardened Heart. Moses had not seen Egypt in 40 years. He had left as a young man running from a killing. He was returning as an old man carrying a staff that turned into a serpent. The city had not changed as much as he had. The same stone, the same heat, the same smell of the Nile in the morning, the same distance between the people who gave the orders and the people whose backs absorbed the consequences of those orders. What had changed was Moses, and what was about to change was everything else. He found Aaron first. The text says God had told Aaron to go into the wilderness to meet Moses. And Aaron went and found him at the mountain of God and kissed him. Brothers, separated by decades and circumstance, meeting in the desert before the thing they were about to walk into together. The text does not describe what that reunion felt like. It simply records that they met, that Moses told Aaron everything God had said, and that the two of them went together to assemble the elders of Israel. Moses and Aaron performed the signs before the people. The staff became a serpent. The hand became leprous and then clean again. And the people believed. When they heard that God had seen their misery and was concerned about them, the text says they bowed down and worshipped. This is the last moment of easy agreement for a very long time. Hold it while it lasts. Then Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh. We do not know which Pharaoh this was. The biblical text does not give us his personal name. And the question of which historical ruler of Egypt corresponds to the Pharaoh of the Exodus is one of the most genuinely debated questions in the intersection of biblical studies and ancient history. Serious scholars have proposed multiple candidates across several centuries of Egyptian history, and the evidence does not settle the question cleanly in any direction. What the text gives us is not a historical dossier but a portrait. The portrait of a man whose power had become so total that the idea of bending to the request of 2 old men from a population of slaves struck him as beneath consideration. Moses and Aaron said to Pharaoh, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." That response is worth reading slowly. Pharaoh was not posturing. He was not buying time. He genuinely did not recognize the authority being invoked. In his theological world, he was not simply a powerful man. He was the son of the sun god, the living embodiment of divine order, the point at which heaven and earth met in a single human body. The God of Israel was not a deity whose name appeared in any register of powers that Pharaoh was required to take seriously. Who is the Lord? That question is, in a sense, what the next several chapters of the biblical story exist to answer. Because what follows is not simply a series of dramatic events. Many interpreters across many centuries have read the 10 plagues as a systematic challenge to the entire religious imagination of Egypt, a confrontation with the symbols and assumptions that undergirded Egyptian civilization's claim to permanence and divine favor. The Nile turned to blood. The frogs, the gnats, the flies, the death of Egyptian livestock, the boils, the hail, the locusts, the 3 days of complete darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn. When you read them in that sequence, something becomes visible that a quick reading misses. These are not random catastrophes arriving in no particular order. They move from the most public and visible to the most intimate and devastating. They begin with the Nile, the source of all Egyptian life and an object of profound religious significance, and they end in the bedroom of every Egyptian family. At the moment of deepest vulnerability, when the children are asleep, each confrontation follows roughly the same structure. Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. They deliver the message. Pharaoh refuses. The consequence arrives. Pharaoh calls for Moses and Aaron in the middle of the suffering and agrees to let the people go. The suffering stops. Pharaoh changes his mind. This cycle, repeated 10 times with escalating intensity, has generated more theological commentary than almost any other sequence in the Exodus narrative. Specifically, one problem has troubled readers for centuries. The text says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Not once, multiple times. And the question this raises is one that honest engagement with the text cannot avoid. If God hardened Pharaoh's heart, then Pharaoh could not freely choose to let the people go. And if he could not freely choose, in what sense was he morally responsible for refusing? These are real questions without simple answers. But there is something in the text itself that complicates the reading of God as the sole agent of Pharaoh's stubbornness. In the early plagues, the text says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. The language shifts from Pharaoh hardening his heart to God hardening it as the narrative progresses. What the text seems to be describing is something closer to a process than a single divine intervention. A man who has spent his entire life in a position where reality bends to his will, where his word is the final word, where his identity is constructed around the idea that he is the axis of the created order, encounters something that will not bend to him, and his response is to become more rigid, more certain, more unwilling to acknowledge that something outside his control is happening. Pharaoh did not simply refuse to let the people go. He refused in the specific way that people refuse when the alternative requires them to admit that they are not what they have always believed themselves to be. The hardening of his heart is the hardening of a man who would rather watch his country suffer than acknowledge that his entire understanding of himself and his world was built on something that would not hold. And through all of it, Moses kept coming back. That detail is easy to overlook because the plagues are so dramatic. But notice what Moses was doing with his body during those months. He was waking up every morning and returning to a palace that had almost certainly issued an order for his death 40 years earlier. He was standing in the presence of the most powerful man in the world, a man who had every earthly authority to have him killed where he stood, and delivering the same message: "Let my people go." Every time Pharaoh refused, every time the suffering ended and Pharaoh changed his mind and then changed his mind again, every time Moses could reasonably have said, "I told you at the burning bush this would not work. Let me go back to Midian." He kept coming back, not because he was not afraid, but because the burning bush was behind him and Egypt was in front of him, and he had said, "Here I am," to a voice that did not accept withdrawal. There is a moment in the middle of the plague sequence that tends to get lost between the spectacle of frogs and the drama of locusts. It is the moment when Moses and Aaron performed signs before Pharaoh and the Egyptian magicians attempted to replicate them. The staff became a serpent, and the magicians threw down their staffs, and they also became serpents. But then Moses' serpent swallowed the magician's serpents. That image is not in the story for dramatic effect alone. It is the text's early signal about what is actually happening in this confrontation. This is not a contest between two equal powers. This is an encounter between a genuine authority and every imitation of it. Egypt's best attempt to demonstrate equivalent power produced something that the actual thing simply consumed. By the time the later plagues arrive, the Egyptian magicians have stopped trying to replicate them. They stood before Pharaoh after the plague of gnats and said, "This is the finger of God." The people whose professional role was to maintain the narrative that Egypt's religious system was sufficient to explain and manage the world were the first to admit that it was not. Pharaoh refused to listen. The text says, "Even then," and Moses came back again. 9 times Pharaoh got an answer to his question and hardened himself against it. The 10th answer was coming, and after that, nothing in Egypt would ever be the same. Chapter 6. The night everything changed. God told Moses what was coming, not in vague terms, not in the language of approaching judgment that leaves room for interpretation. In specific, Operational detail. Moses received instructions about a meal, about an animal, about blood and doorposts, and the exact position of the body during the eating, and what to do with the leftovers before morning came. God told Moses that at midnight, every firstborn in Egypt would die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh sitting on his throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, from the firstborn of the cattle in the field, there would be a cry throughout Egypt, such as had never been heard before, and would never be heard again. And then God told Moses what the Israelites needed to do to be passed over. Each household was to take a lamb. If the household was too small for a whole lamb, they were to share with a neighbor. The lamb was to be without defect. They were to slaughter it at twilight and take the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the house where they ate. That night they were to roast the lamb and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They were to eat it with their cloaks tucked into their belts, their sandals on their feet, their staff in their hand. They were to eat it in haste. This is the Passover of the Lord. Moses called all the elders of Israel and told them everything. And here is where I want to slow down, because there is a question in the middle of this night that the narrative does not answer directly, but that matters enormously for understanding who Moses was and what his role actually cost him. Where was Moses during the night of the Passover? The text does not say. It tells us Moses delivered the instructions. It tells us what the Israelites did in response. It tells us what happened in Egypt at midnight. But Moses himself, the man at the center of everything, disappears from the narrative at the moment. The night begins and reappears only when Pharaoh summons him in the darkness. He gave the instructions, and then he had to wait like everyone else. Think about what that waiting meant. Moses had stood in front of Pharaoh 9 times. He had delivered the word and watched the word become reality. He had seen the Nile turn. He had watched the frogs come up out of the water and cover the land. He had stood in Egyptian darkness so complete that people could not see each other or move from where they were. He had been the instrument of every one of those things. But tonight was different. Tonight, Moses could not go to each house and mark the doorpost himself. He could not stand between the angel and the firstborn of any particular Hebrew family and make sure they were protected by the force of his own presence. He could not control this one. He had delivered the word, and now every family had to decide, alone, in their own house, whether they believed it enough to act on it. The blood on the doorpost was not something Moses could apply for them. Each family had to take the lamb. Each family had to slaughter it themselves. Each family had to dip the branch of hyssop in the blood and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with their own hands. Moses had spent his life trying to act on behalf of his people. He had killed a man on behalf of his people. He had stood before Pharaoh on behalf of his people. He had carried the staff and delivered the plagues on behalf of his people. And now, on the most important night in the history of those people, the thing that would protect them was something he could not do for them at all. He had brought them to the threshold. Each family had to cross it themselves. There is something in that arrangement that is not accidental. The Passover is not a spectacle to be witnessed. It is a participation to be entered. The lamb has to be chosen. The blood has to be applied. The meal has to be eaten standing, with sandals on and staff in hand, as if you are already in motion, even before you know whether the motion will be required. The posture of departure has to be assumed before departure is certain. Faith, in this moment, looks like a family eating a meal in haste with their shoes on. And across the land of Goshen, in house after house, that is exactly what was happening. Families who had lived their entire lives under the weight of Egyptian power, who had built Egyptian cities with their hands and buried their sons in Egyptian soil, who had prayed to the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the quiet ways that oppressed people pray, without performance or public ceremony, in the spaces between the work. Those families were taking a lamb and a branch of hyssop and marking their doors with blood in the dark. They did not know for certain it would work. They had Moses' word. They had the word of a man who had come back from 40 years in the desert, carrying a staff and a story about a burning bush. A man who had shown them signs and whom they had believed, but who had also watched Pharaoh increase their workload in response to the first confrontation, who had led them through 9 escalating catastrophes with no resolution, who had been promising that this would end for months while the bricks kept needing to be made. They believed, or they acted as if they believed, which in the dark of that night amounted to the same thing. They marked their doors. They ate the meal. They waited. At midnight, God struck down every firstborn in Egypt, the firstborn of Pharaoh on his throne, the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, the firstborn of the cattle. In every Egyptian house there was someone dead. There was not a house where there was not at least one person mourning. But in the houses with blood on the doorposts, nothing. Pharaoh got up in the night, he and all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, because there was not a house without someone dead. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the night, not in the morning, not after he had composed himself or consulted his advisors or found a way to frame the situation that preserved his dignity. In the night, in the middle of the crying, in the middle of his own grief, Pharaoh sent for Moses. "Get up," he said. "Leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds, as you have said, and go, and also bless me." That last sentence, "and also bless me," the man who had asked 9 times, "Who is the Lord?" who is not something I recognize or am required to honor, was now asking the representative of that Lord for a blessing. In the middle of his grief, in the darkness of a night that had broken something in him that could not be unbroken, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country. They gave them silver and gold and clothing, pressed into their hands by people who were afraid, who wanted them gone, who understood in a way they had not understood 9 plagues ago that the continued presence of this people in Egypt was not sustainable, at the cost that sustaining it was now extracting. The Israelites had been in Egypt for 430 years. On the day they left, the text says, all the divisions of the Lord went out. 430 years ended in a night. Moses organized a people who had never organized themselves as a free people. This was not an army with ranks and orders and a chain of command developed through years of training. This was a population of slaves who had been told to leave immediately, in the dark, carrying whatever they could carry, moving toward a destination that most of them had never seen, led by a man most of them had not known existed 6 months ago. And Moses carried something extra with him out of Egypt. He carried bones, the bones of Joseph, who had come to Egypt generations earlier, who had saved both Egypt and his own family from famine, who had made his brothers swear before he died that when God came to their aid and led them out of Egypt, they would carry his bones with them. Moses remembered that oath. In the middle of everything, in the organizing of millions of people, and the first hours of a departure that would reshape human history, Moses went and got the bones of a man who had died centuries before and carried them in the procession. He was moving forward, and he was carrying the past with him, both things at once, as he always had been. The Israelites left Egypt. The Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide their way during the day and a pillar of fire to give them light at night. The slaves who had built a civilization with their backs were no longer building it. But slavery is not only a condition of the body, it is a condition of the imagination, a condition of what you believe is possible for yourself, what you think you deserve, what you trust when you are afraid. Egypt had ended. What had not yet ended was everything Egypt had put inside them. That would take longer than a night to undo. Moses walked out of Egypt for the second time in his life. The first time he had been running. This time he was leading. The desert was ahead. The people were free. And the gap between those two facts, between the freedom they now had and the formation they would need to live inside that freedom was about to become the terrain of the next 40 years of his life. Chapter 7. The Sea and the Song. 3 days after leaving Egypt, the people were thirsty. Hold that number. 3 days. Not 3 months. Not 3 years. 3 days after witnessing the most dramatic sequence of divine interventions in their collective memory. 3 days after the night that ended 430 years of slavery. 3 days after walking out of the most powerful empire on earth, with silver and gold pressed into their hands by Egyptians who were afraid of them. The people were thirsty, and the water they found was bitter, and they grumbled against Moses. "What will we drink?" Moses cried out to the Lord. God showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. And they moved on. This small moment at a place called Marah, which means bitter, is easy to skip because what comes before it and after it are so much larger. But it establishes a rhythm that will define the next 40 years of Moses' life. Crisis arrives. People turn on Moses. Moses turns to God. God provides. People move forward. Repeat. Moses had not signed up for this rhythm when he said, "Here I am at the burning bush." He had been commissioned to bring the people out of Egypt. He had done that. What nobody had made fully clear, or what he had not fully understood until he was standing in the middle of it, was that bringing a people out of slavery was only the beginning of the problem. The harder problem was what came next. But before we get there, we need to go back to the sea, because between the bitterness of Marah and the night of the Passover, something happened that belongs in its own space entirely. After the Israelites left Egypt, Pharaoh changed his mind. Of course he did. When Pharaoh and his officials looked at the situation in the morning light, without the darkness and the grief and the sound of crying that had driven him to summon Moses in the night, the calculation looked different. The labor force was gone. The people who had been building his store cities, who had been the economic engine of a significant portion of Egyptian productivity, had walked out into the desert, and he had told them to go. He said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So Pharaoh took 600 of his best chariots, and all the other chariots of Egypt, and pursued the Israelites, the army of the most powerful military in the known world, with horses and trained soldiers, bearing down on a column of former slaves, moving on foot through the desert with their children and their livestock and the bones of Joseph. The Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians, marching after them. They were terrified, and they said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Did we not say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone and let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Read that carefully. They were asking to go back, less than 2 weeks out of slavery, standing at the edge of a sea with an army behind them. The people were telling Moses that the slavery they had just escaped was preferable to the freedom that currently looked like it was going to kill them. This was not cowardice. This was the specific psychology of people who have been shaped by bondage for so long that freedom, when it arrives in a form that is terrifying rather than comfortable, does not feel like freedom. It feels like a different kind of danger. At least in Egypt, they had known the shape of the threat. They had known the parameters of their suffering. This, the open desert and the approaching army and the sea that would not move, had no parameters they recognized. Moses said to them, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then God said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. Not pray first. Not wait for me to act while you stand still. Move. Raise the staff. Tell the people to go forward. There is a tradition in Jewish interpretation that holds that the sea did not part when Moses raised his staff, that it only began to part when the first Israelites stepped into the water, when someone decided to move before the way was clear. The text itself does not specify the precise moment of the parting, but the tradition points at something real in the structure of the event. The miracle and the movement are not sequential. One completed before the other begins. They happen together. The people move and the sea moves. Faith and action are not separate categories here. They are the same thing expressed in two different directions. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night God drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptian army followed them in. During the last watch of the night, God looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He made the wheels of their chariots come off so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let us get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then God said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians." Moses stretched out his hand, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. The Israelites saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. They trusted him, standing on the far shore, with the bodies of the Egyptian army lying on the sand behind them and dry ground under their feet and the whole desert ahead of them. The people trusted Moses. That trust would not last until the next crisis without beginning to fracture. But in this moment, on this morning, it was real. Then Moses and the Israelites sang, "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." The Song of Moses is one of the oldest pieces of poetry in the Hebrew Bible. Scholars who study the linguistic features of ancient Hebrew suggest that the language in this poem reflects very early forms of the text, older than much of the surrounding prose narrative. This is not a song composed long after the event and inserted for dramatic effect. The linguistic evidence points toward its genuine antiquity, toward a piece of actual poetry from a moment that was actually happening, which means that Moses, the man who had told God 4 times that he was not good with words, the man who was slow of speech and slow of tongue, the man who had needed his brother as a voice because his own was insufficient. That man stood on the far shore of the sea and sang, and Miriam took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. And Miriam sang, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted." The sister and the brother, separated by decades and circumstance, and the particular distance that the palace had placed between the life Moses had lived and the life his family had lived, were standing on the same shore singing the same song. The sea was behind them. The desert was ahead. The water that had swallowed the Egyptian army was already settling back into its ordinary motion. And the people who 3 days later would be thirsty and grumbling at Marah, who weeks after that would be hungry and wishing they were back in Egypt at their pots of meat. Those people stood on the shore and sang. They had been slaves in the morning. By nightfall, they were standing on dry ground on the far side of a sea that had opened for them and closed on the army that had pursued them. One day does not undo 430 years. The song was real and the freedom was real, but the work of becoming people who knew how to live as free people was barely beginning. Moses knew this, or was beginning to know it. He had brought them out. The burning bush part, the Pharaoh part, the plagues and the sea. That was the part he had been commissioned for, and the part he had accomplished despite 5 attempts to decline it. What came next was something the burning bush had not fully described. The wilderness was ahead. The people were free, and the distance between those two facts, between the freedom they now possessed and the formation they would need to live inside it, was the terrain Moses would spend the rest of his life crossing. He was standing at the edge of it now, on the far shore, with the song still in the air, and his sister dancing, and the bones of Joseph in someone's arms, and the whole impossible next chapter waiting for him in the dry ground ahead. The sea had not been the hardest part. The desert was going to be the hardest part, and it was just beginning. Chapter 8. The Mountain and the Law. They arrived at the mountain 3 months after leaving Egypt. 3 months of desert. 3 months of manna appearing on the ground each morning, like dew that could be eaten. Of water coming from rocks. Of quail arriving in the evening when the people complained that they missed the meat of Egypt. 3 months of the particular rhythm of miraculous provision that was already, in 3 months, beginning to feel ordinary to people who had never in their lives experienced anything like it. The mountain was called Sinai, or Oreb. The biblical text uses both names, and scholars have debated their relationship for centuries without arriving at a consensus that satisfies everyone. What matters for this story is not the precise geological identity of the mountain, but what happened on it, and what that happening meant for every human being who has lived in its downstream since. Moses went up to God. That phrase appears in the text with a simplicity that does not prepare you for what it contains. Moses went up to God. As if going up to God were a thing that could be described in 5 words without further elaboration. As if the sentence did not require the reader to stop and ask what it actually meant for a human body to go up to a mountain where God was, and to come back down carrying something that had not existed in the world before he went up. God called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession." My treasured possession. In a world where nations understood themselves in relation to their gods, where divine favor was the thing that distinguished one people from another and gave their existence cosmic meaning, that phrase was not decorative language. It was a claim about identity and belonging that went deeper than any political arrangement or territorial boundary. Egypt had its son of the gods on the throne. Other nations had their patron deities and their divine patronage. Israel was being offered something different. Not the protection of a powerful deity who had chosen their land or their resources as worthy of his attention, but a relationship of the kind implied by the word treasured, personal, chosen, held. Moses came back down and set before the elders all the words God had commanded him to speak. And the people all responded together and said, "We will do everything the Lord has said." Moses reported their answer to God. Then God told Moses to have the people prepare themselves. In 3 days, God said, he would come down in the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai. There were to be limits placed around the mountain. No one was to touch it. When the ram's horn sounded, the people could approach. On the morning of the 3rd day there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. "Stop here, not because we need to catalog what happened next. Stop here because of what the people did." The people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke. They trembled with fear, and they stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." They pushed Moses forward. The same people who months earlier had asked, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us?" The same population who had grumbled about bitter water and missing meat, and the various hardships of freedom, stood at the foot of a mountain wrapped in fire and smoke and thunder, and made a decision about their own capacity. They could not do this. They could not stand in the presence of what was happening on that mountain. They were not built for it, or they did not believe they were built for it, which in this moment amounted to the same thing. They wanted what the mountain contained. They wanted the law and the covenant and the treasured possession relationship with the God who had brought them out on eagle's wings. But they wanted all of that delivered through a human intermediary, through a man who would go up into the smoke and come back down with something they could hold. They wanted Moses to stand between them and God so they did not have to. And Moses, who had spent his entire life being pushed into spaces between things he did not entirely belong to, went up the mountain, into the cloud, into the smoke and the fire and the presence of something that the people at the foot of the mountain had decided they could not approach directly. He was gone for 40 days and 40 nights. What Moses received on that mountain was not simply a legal code. It was the complete architecture of how a people who had been slaves for 4 centuries were supposed to live as free people in covenant with God. That is an entirely different kind of document from a list of regulations. Laws govern behavior under threat of consequence. What Moses received was a vision of what human life looks like when it is oriented toward something larger than itself, toward a God who had chosen to be in relationship with a particular people and who was now describing what that relationship required from their side. The 10 Commandments are the moral and theological center of what happened on that mountain, but they are the beginning, not the entirety. Beyond them came the laws about justice and property, and the treatment of the vulnerable, and the observance of the Sabbath, and the construction of a place where the divine presence could dwell among the people, rather than only on a mountain they were too afraid to approach. The scope of what Moses was given was formational. It was the curriculum for the transformation of a slave population into a covenant community. And Moses, standing on that mountain receiving all of it, was the only person in the world who could have been given this and carried it back down. He had grown up in a palace. He knew how complex administrative systems worked, how laws were written and enforced, how leaders managed large populations. Egypt had given him that. He had spent 40 years in the wilderness. He knew the terrain, the rhythms of desert life, the practical requirements of keeping a large group of people alive in hostile landscape. Midian had given him that. And now, on this mountain, he was receiving the theological and ethical framework that would hold all of it together. 3 educations, 3 classrooms, all of them converging in one man, on one mountain, over 40 days. But Moses on the mountain was also Moses the intercessor in a new and more demanding way. Because standing between God and the people was not only a matter of carrying the law down from the mountain, it was a matter of holding the 2 parties to each other when they did not hold themselves, of representing the people before God when the people were not representing themselves well, of carrying the weight of a relationship that both sides were committed to in theory and that one side, in particular, was going to find very difficult to sustain in practice. He did not know yet how soon that difficulty would become visible. He was on the mountain. He had been on the mountain for 30 days. For 40 days, the cloud covered him, and the glory of God was like a consuming fire on top of the mountain in the eyes of the Israelites below. Down in the camp, the people were watching a mountain covered in fire and waiting for a man to come back. 40 days is a long time to wait for someone you cannot see or hear from. In a desert, with no way of knowing whether they are alive or dead. In a world where the only structure you have ever known has just been dismantled and the new structure has not yet arrived. 40 days is a long time. The people grew restless. And in the restlessness, in the space between the God they had promised to serve and the man who had gone up to meet that God and had not come back, they did something that would define one of the most painful chapters in the entire story of Moses. They decided to make God more manageable. Moses did not know this yet. He was still on the mountain. The law was in his hands. 2 tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. And the camp below was already burning with something that was not the fire of God. Chapter 9. The Golden Calf and the Man Who Stood Between Wrath and Mercy. God spoke first. Moses was still on the mountain when it happened. He had not yet seen what was happening in the camp below. God told him, "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it, and sacrificed to it, and have said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.'" Notice how God says it. Your people, not my people, not the people I chose and brought out on eagle's wings and called my treasured possession 3 months ago on this same mountain. Your people, the people Moses brought out of Egypt. It is the language of someone who is angry enough to create distance between themselves and the thing that has just done the thing they specifically said not to do. And then God said something that would define the next few minutes of Moses' life. "I have seen these people, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." There it is. The offer that Moses had not known was coming, and that, once it arrived, he could not unhear. God was not making an announcement. He was opening a space in the conversation. He was telling Moses what he intended to do, and by framing it as a request that Moses leave him alone, he was implicitly asking Moses what Moses was going to do with this information. The offer was extraordinary by any measure. The people who had just broken the covenant they had made 3 months ago, who had melted their gold jewelry into the shape of an animal and bowed down to it while Moses was on the mountain receiving the law they were already violating, would be destroyed. And from Moses, from this one man who had tried 5 times to decline the original commission, God would build a new nation, a nation that would be great. The promises made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the promises that the current descendants of those men had just demonstrated they were not yet equipped to carry, would be redirected to someone who had shown, across 40 years of reluctant obedience, that he was actually capable of the kind of faithfulness the promises required. Moses could have said yes. He could have said yes, and no one who knew the previous several months would have called it an unreasonable response. He had been grumbled at and questioned and blamed for every difficulty since the day the people left Egypt. He had carried them through the sea and fed them with bread from heaven and given water from rock, and now they were down in the camp making a golden calf, while he was still on the mountain receiving the law that would have organized their entire lives around the God who had just fed them and watered them and protected them and called them his treasured possession. He could have said yes. He did not say yes. What Moses said instead is one of the most remarkable speeches in the entire biblical narrative. Not because it is eloquent or theologically sophisticated in the way that a trained theologian might structure an argument, but because of what it reveals about who Moses had become in the years since the burning bush, and because of what it costs him to say it. Moses said to the Lord his God, "Lord, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Your people, not my people." Moses gave them back. He was not accepting the reassignment of ownership that God's language had implied. He was refusing it. These were not Moses's people who had done this terrible thing. They were God's people, the same people God had called his treasured possession, the same people God had brought out on eagle's wings. Calling them your people and mine would not change that. And Moses was not going to accept a framing that made their failure a reason to dissolve the relationship God had initiated with them. Then Moses made 3 arguments. Not 1, 3. The first was about how the nations would read what happened next. Why should the Egyptians say that God brought them out with evil intent? To kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth. Everything God had done in Egypt. The 10 plagues. The Passover. The sea. had been visible to the watching world. If God now destroyed the people he had so publicly delivered, every nation with eyes would conclude that the God of Israel was not a God who could be trusted with the people he claimed to love. Moses was thinking about God's reputation in the world, not his own survival, not his own elevation to the head of a new nation. The second argument was about consistency. "Turn from your fierce anger," Moses said. "Relent and do not bring disaster on your people." This is the argument that makes readers in every century stop. Moses is asking God to change course. He is not arguing that the people do not deserve judgment. They clearly do. He is arguing that judgment of this totality is not consistent with the kind of God this God has revealed himself to be. A God who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. Moses knew God well enough to argue with God about God's own character. The third argument was the deepest. "Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. You said to them, 'I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever.'" Moses invoked the oath. Not a law, not a conditional arrangement that could be voided when one party failed. An oath, a promise God had made by swearing on his own name. The only thing in existence by which God could swear. An unconditional commitment made to Abraham and repeated to Isaac and repeated again to Jacob. A commitment that did not include a clause releasing God from it when the descendants of those men made a golden calf in the desert. Moses was telling God that destroying these people would require God to break a promise God had made to himself. And the text says the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. Sit with that. The Lord relented. This is not a moment to flatten into systematic theology before its weight has been felt. The text is saying that Moses changed the outcome, that the conversation between Moses and God on that mountain ended differently than it would have ended if Moses had not spoken, that the words of one human being, standing between an angry God and a broken people, made a difference that was real enough to alter what happened next. Moses came down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of stone in his hands. Joshua was with him as he descended. And Joshua heard the noise from the camp and said to Moses, "There is the sound of war in the camp." Moses said, "It is not the sound of victory. It is not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of singing that I hear." When Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. He had just come from the mountain where he had argued for the people's survival. He had stood between God's anger and their lives and held back the destruction through the force of his own intercession. He had spent 40 days receiving the law that was supposed to organize their entire existence into something holy and coherent and worthy of the relationship God had offered them. And he came down and saw them dancing. The tablets hit the ground. This is not a contradiction in Moses. It is a revelation of his full humanity. He had argued for them before God with everything he had. He had believed in their capacity to be what God was calling them to be. He had put his own potential elevation, his own offer of a fresh start with a new and presumably more reliable nation, on the table and walked away from it for their sake. And then he saw them dancing around a golden calf, and something in him broke in a way that the intercession had not prevented and could not contain. He took the calf and burned it in the fire, and ground it to powder, and scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. He confronted Aaron, who gave Moses one of the most inadequate explanations in the history of inadequate explanations. "I threw the gold into the fire," Aaron said, "and out came this calf," as if the calf had assembled itself, as if Aaron had simply been standing nearby when a spontaneous bovine sculpture emerged from the flames. Then Moses stood at the entrance to the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." The Levites rallied to him. What followed was a terrible thing. Moses commanded them to go through the camp and execute those who had led the worship of the calf. About 3,000 people died that day. And the next morning Moses said to the people, "You have committed a great sin. But now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. Perhaps." He did not know if it would work. He had already interceded once, and the outcome had been uncertain enough that he had not told the people he was going to do it. He was going back up the mountain to try again, to stand between them and the consequences of what they had done, without any guarantee that the second intercession would succeed. He went up, and he said to God, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold. But now, please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written. Blot me out." Moses was offering his own place in the story in exchange for the people's continued presence in it. Not as a theological formula, as the actual position of a man who had been standing between God and this people long enough that he could not conceive of his own continued existence in a world where they had been erased. His fate had become bound up with theirs in a way he had not chosen and could not undo. God said, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. Now go. Lead the people to the place I spoke of, and my angel will go before you." God did not accept Moses' offer. He did not blot Moses out. He also did not give Moses the complete restoration he was asking for. He told Moses to keep leading, to take the people forward, that the consequences of what they had done would come in time, but that they were not destroyed, that the relationship, damaged and bearing the weight of what had just happened, was continuing. The covenant was not canceled. It was strained. There is a difference. Moses came back down to the camp. Aaron was still there. This is the moment the narrative tends to move past quickly, and it deserves more space than it usually receives. Aaron was Moses' brother. Aaron was the man God had appointed as Moses' voice, the person who had stood beside Moses in front of Pharaoh through 10 plagues. Aaron was the designated high priest of Israel. And Aaron had collected the gold jewelry of the people and melted it down and made the calf and told the people, "These are your gods," and built an altar and proclaimed a festival and stood in the middle of the dancing when Moses came down the mountain. Moses confronted him. Aaron told him the story about throwing the gold into the fire and the calf emerging on its own. And Moses did not have Aaron killed. Why not? The text does not give us Moses' reasoning. It simply records that Aaron was not among those executed that day, that his sons continued in the priestly line, that the institution of the priesthood was not dismantled as a result of what its first occupant had done at its most critical moment. Moses had looked at that face his entire adult life, at the edge of the Nile when they were boys, in the wilderness when God sent Aaron out to meet him, in the throne room of Pharaoh through 9 confrontations. He knew what fear looked like on that face, and what he saw when he came down the mountain was not a man who had chosen another god over his own. It was a man who had been alone with 2 million frightened people for 40 days and had done the worst thing available to him to keep them from dissolving entirely. Aaron had failed catastrophically. He had also been standing in an impossible position, holding a terrified people together in the absence of the one person who gave their whole situation coherence, making decisions under the kind of pressure that does things to people that they cannot entirely control. Moses understood that kind of failure from the inside. He had killed an Egyptian in a moment of impulse that he immediately knew was wrong. He had run from both his worlds when standing in either of them became impossible. He was not, at the critical moments of his own early life, the person he was supposed to be either. He did not excuse what Aaron had done. He confronted it directly. He forced Aaron to hear the truth of what he had done. But he did not destroy him. The covenant was strained but continuing. The relationship between Moses and his brother was strained but continuing. The relationship between Moses and a people who had just proven that they would break the covenant at the first opportunity of sufficient length and fear was strained but continuing. Moses was still between God's justice and the people's survival. between his own grief and his continued responsibility for the people who had caused the grief, between his brother's catastrophic failure and his brother's continuing role in the story. He had saved them. He had smashed the tablets. He had gone back up the mountain. He had offered to be blotted out. And now he was going to have to take them forward into the desert again. With new tablets, he would have to carve himself, carrying the weight of what had just happened alongside the weight of everything that had happened before it, toward a land they had not yet seen, and a future they had not yet earned, and a covenant that had been damaged but not dissolved. This was the work of the man between worlds. Not the dramatic moment, not the raised staff and the parting sea. This, the morning after the golden calf, when Moses had to look at the people who had just broken his heart and God's heart and take them forward anyway, because they were still his people, and he was still theirs. Chapter 10, The Wilderness Years. Not every day in the wilderness was a crisis. That is easy to forget when reading the account, because the account preserves the crises. The water that was bitter, the hunger that produced nostalgia for Egyptian slavery, the rebellion of Korah, the spies who came back from Canaan with a report that turned into a catastrophe, the various moments when the ground seemed to shift beneath everything Moses had been trying to build in the desert. But between those moments were days that were not recorded because they did not require recording. Days when the manna was on the ground in the morning, and the people gathered it, and the children ran between the tents, and the elders sat in the shade, and the ordinary business of a large community moving through time simply continued. Days when nothing dramatic happened, and the sun went down the same as it had risen, without catastrophe or miracle. Just the unremarkable passage of one more day in the life of a people, learning how to be a people. Not all of them dramatic, most of them ordinary. The wilderness had a texture that is impossible to recover fully from the written account. The sand and the rock, the heat of the day and the cold of the night, the sound of that many people and animals in proximity, the combination of voices and movement and cooking and arguing and praying and the particular noise of a community that has no walls and no fixed address and no certainty about tomorrow. Moses knew all of it. Every day, for 40 years. He knew all of it, and he was still between the God who was patient in ways that defied calculation, who had relented after the golden calf, and continued providing and continued guiding and continued speaking with Moses face to face, the way a man speaks with a friend, and a people who were free in their bodies and not yet free in the deepest parts of themselves. A people who kept looking backward at Egypt when the forward way was hard, who kept reducing the miraculous to the ordinary fast enough to make you wonder whether any amount of provision would ever be sufficient to produce genuine trust. Moses stood between them, every day, for 40 years. Let us talk about the day Jethro came. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, the priest of Midian, heard about everything God had done for Moses and for Israel. He came to Moses in the wilderness, bringing Zipporah and Moses' 2 sons with him. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and went into the tent. Moses told Jethro everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship they had met along the way and how the Lord had saved them. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel. And then the next morning Jethro watched Moses work. Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. From morning till evening, not a dedicated court session with scheduled appointments. A continuous stream of people bringing their disputes and their questions and their conflicts to Moses, and Moses sitting there adjudicating all of it. Alone, for the entire day. Jethro watched this and said, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge, while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties, and inform them of God's decrees and instructions. Jethro said, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone." The man who received the law from God on the mountain, the man who argued with God and changed the outcome, the man who parted the sea and led a nation out of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. That man is sitting in the desert being told by his Midianite father-in-law that his management structure is unsustainable. And Moses listened. He did not say, "I have spoken with God face to face. I think I understand my responsibilities." He did not say, "The administration of 2 million Israelites is slightly outside your area of expertise." He listened. He heard the practical wisdom being offered to him by an older man who loved him and who was looking at the situation with fresh eyes. And he did what Jethro suggested. He selected capable men from all Israel, men who feared God and were trustworthy and who hated dishonest gain, and appointed them as officials over thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. This is one of the most quietly remarkable moments in the entire story of Moses. It tends to get overlooked because it does not involve a miracle or a confrontation or a theological turning point. What it involves is Moses being teachable. He was 80 years old, or close to it. He had more direct experience of God than any human being alive. He had more authority than any person in the camp. And he sat down and listened to his father-in-law explain organizational management to him and then changed the way he was doing his job. The man who had been educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and had received the law on Sinai was humble enough to take practical advice from a Midianite priest. But Jethro went home, and the days continued. And then came the day the people cried and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, the cucumbers, the melons, the lakes, the onions and the garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. The manna that appeared on the ground every morning, the bread from heaven, the provision that had sustained them since they left Egypt, the daily miracle they had been eating long enough to call it monotonous." Moses heard the people of every family wailing at the entrance to their tents. And Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms? As a nurse carries an infant, to the land you promised on oath to their ancestors. Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, 'Give us meat to eat.' I cannot carry all these people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you are going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me. If I have found favor in your eyes, let me not face my own ruin. Please go ahead and kill me." Stay with that sentence. This is not a man performing distress for an audience. This is a man who has reached the bottom of something and is reporting it honestly to the only one he trusts to hear it without collapsing. Moses had been given more direct access to God than any human being alive. He had seen the burning bush and stood on Sinai and spoken face to face and received the law from the finger of God. And here he is in the desert, surrounded by people complaining about their miraculous food, asking God to kill him rather than make him continue. Not because he had lost faith, but because the weight of carrying a people who could not stop looking backward, who could not stop transforming every provision into an occasion for complaint, had reached a point that the body and soul of one human being could not absorb without breaking. He was not performing distress. He was reporting it, with the same honesty he had brought to the burning bush when he said, "Please send someone else." God responded with provision and with relief. 70 elders of Israel were commissioned to share the burden of leadership. Quail came in such quantities that they piled up around the camp for a day's journey in every direction. The people had asked for meat, and they received meat. more than they could possibly consume. The provision arrived. The burden was distributed. Moses did not die. But the days kept coming, and then came the spies. God told Moses to send 12 men, one from each tribe, to explore the land of Canaan. They went for 40 days. They came back with a cluster of grapes so large that it took 2 men to carry it on a pole between them, along with pomegranates and figs from the land that flowed with milk and honey. And 10 of the 12 said they could not take the land. The people who live there are powerful. The 10 said, the cities are fortified and very large. We saw the descendants of Anak there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And we looked the same to them. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. That sentence is one of the most psychologically precise statements in the entire wilderness narrative. The 10 spies were not only reporting what they had observed about the tactical situation in Canaan, they were reporting something about themselves, about the way that 4 centuries of slavery had shaped their self-perception at a level that the Passover and the sea and the manna and the law had not yet fully reached. They were free people who still saw themselves as grasshoppers. Caleb and Joshua, the other 2 spies, said something different. We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the people listened to the 10, and that night the whole community raised a loud cry. The people wept throughout the night. They grumbled against Moses and Aaron and said, if only we had died in Egypt, or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? And then they said it. We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Back to Egypt. After everything. After the sea and Sinai and manna and quail and water from rocks and the pillar of cloud and fire. After the burning bush and the plagues and the Passover and the intercession and the golden calf and the renewed covenant. After all of it. The people were standing in the wilderness saying they wanted to go back to Egypt and choose a different leader to take them there. Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly. Not words. Not an argument. Not an intercession. They fell on their faces. There is a point in the carrying of an impossible weight when the body simply acknowledges what the mind has been refusing to say. Moses had argued and interceded and managed and judged and led and endured and continued and continued and continued. And now he was on the ground. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes. Do not be afraid of the people of the land, they said. The Lord is with us. The congregation threatened to stone them. God intervened. His glory appeared at the tent of meeting before all the Israelites. And God said to Moses, how long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me? In spite of all the signs I have performed among them, I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them. But I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they. The offer came again, and Moses stood up. He had been on the ground a moment ago. The people had just threatened to stone him and Caleb and Joshua. He had fallen face down in front of the entire assembly in what looked like the final exhaustion of a man who had run out of everything. And he stood up and interceded again. The same arguments he had used after the golden calf. God's reputation among the nations. God's own stated character. Slow to anger and abounding in love. And the oath to the ancestors. And once again the text says, the Lord said, I have forgiven them, as you asked. But this time there was a consequence that could not be removed by intercession. The generation that had refused to enter the land would not enter the land. They would wander in the wilderness for 40 years. 1 year for each day the spies had explored Canaan, until the last of that generation had died. Their children, the ones they had said would be taken as plunder, those children would be the ones who entered the promised land. The people mourned bitterly. Then, in the way of people who make a decision too late and in the wrong direction, they decided to go up and take the land immediately. Moses said, this will not succeed. Do not go up, because the Lord is not with you. They went anyway. They were defeated. The wilderness continued. 40 years of it. 40 years of the daily rhythm of manna and pillar and complaint and provision and the slow dying off of the generation that had come out of Egypt. Moses watched them die, one by one, and then in groups. The people who had crossed the sea and danced on the far shore were buried in the desert. They had refused to leave. And the days kept coming. Not all of them dramatic. Most of them ordinary. Moses was still standing between. Still there every morning when the people woke up, and still there every evening when they lay down. Still the point through which the relationship between this God and this people had to pass every time it needed to move in either direction. He had fallen face down more than once. He had asked to die more than once. He had interceded more times than the text records. And he had stood up every time. Not because every day was a burning bush, because the man who had said, "Here I am" in the fire had not found a way to unsay it. The days came, and Moses was in the middle of them. All of them. Chapter 11. The Rock. The Water. And the moment everything changed. Miriam died first. The text records it in a single sentence. Miriam died there and was buried there. She had been with Moses from the beginning. Literally, from the beginning. From the edge of the Nile, where she had stood at a careful distance and watched a basket and made a decision that changed everything. She had led the women in singing on the far shore of the sea. She had been a prophet in her own right. And she died in the wilderness of Zin, in a place called Kadesh, and was buried there. And the account of her death takes one sentence. And there was no water for the community. That detail arrives in the very next verse, with a directness that might seem callous until you recognize what the text is doing. Miriam died, and there was no water. The community gathered against Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses. They said, "Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness? That we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs or grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." They had been in the wilderness for nearly 40 years by this point. This was not the first time there had been no water. This was not the second, or the fifth, or the 10th time. Moses had found water before. At Marah, at Rephidim, at various points along the journey that the text records and at others it does not. He had been doing this for 4 decades. He had watched the generation that left Egypt die slowly in the sand and had continued moving the next generation forward toward a land he had never seen. And his sister had just died. The text does not tell us how Moses grieved. It does not give us a scene of mourning or a description of the weight he carried from the moment Miriam's breath stopped. The biblical narrative at this point is austere in a way that requires the reader to supply what the text withholds. Moses had grown up alongside this woman. She had been the one watching from the riverbank. She had been the one who stepped forward and arranged the meeting between the princess and their mother. Without Miriam's quick thinking at the edge of the Nile, there may have been no Moses to stand at the burning bush. Without Miriam, the entire chain of events that followed might not have followed. She was gone, and the people came to Moses and Aaron with no water, and the same complaints they had been making for 40 years, and Moses and Aaron fell on their faces at the entrance to the tent of meeting. God spoke to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so they and their livestock can drink. Speak to the rock, not strike it, not perform the same action that had worked before at Rephidim, where God had told Moses to strike the rock with his staff and water had come out. This time the instruction was different. This time the provision was to come through the medium of speech, through Moses simply addressing the rock in the presence of the community. And the rock responding, Moses took the staff from before the Lord, as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly in front of the rock. And Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Then God said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." That verdict has troubled readers for a very long time. Moses struck the rock instead of speaking to it. He said, "Must we bring you water?" using language that placed himself alongside God as the source of the miracle. He called the people rebels. The water came out, and the people drank, and everything worked the way it was supposed to work. And the consequence was that Moses would not enter the land. It seems, to the modern reader especially, disproportionate. But stay here before reaching for the explanation that makes it feel more proportionate. Because the disproportionality is not an error in the text. It is the point. Moses was not a private individual who lost his temper and struck a rock. He was the mediator of the covenant between God and Israel. He was the man standing between the holy and the human, the person through whom the entire community understood who God was, how God moved, what it looked and sounded like when the divine will was expressed in the physical world. For 40 years, everything Moses did in front of the people was instructive. It taught them something about the nature of the God they were in covenant with. And in this moment, when God had said, "Speak," Moses struck. When God had said the provision would come through the word, Moses said, "Must we bring you water?" and reached for the staff. The "we" is the problem, not a grammatical error, a theological one. Moses placed himself alongside God as the source of what was about to happen. He took something that was supposed to demonstrate the sovereign provision of God and made it look, at least in part, like the result of human action and human authority. The people watching did not need to see Moses perform a miracle. They needed to see God provide through Moses. Those two things look similar from the outside, but they are entirely different from the inside. And the difference matters enormously when you are in the business of teaching an entire nation what God is like. And Moses was in grief. His sister had just died, and the people had come at him again with the same complaints and the same implicit accusation that every difficulty was somehow his fault. He was exhausted in a way that 4 decades of carrying impossible weight produces. He was a human being at the end of something, standing in front of a rock in the desert. And what came out of him in that moment was not the patient mediation of the holy. It was the accumulated exhaustion and grief and anger of a man who had been giving everything he had for 40 years to people who had never stopped making him feel like it was not enough. He struck the rock, not once, twice. The water came out, and God said, "You will not bring this community into the land." Not because God had been waiting for an opportunity to exclude Moses. Not because this moment was secretly the one that Moses had been building toward all along, but because the position Moses held required something from him that the position of an ordinary leader did not require. And in this moment, at the rock, Moses had not given it. He was the man between God and the people. When that man let his exhaustion blur the line between what God was doing and what Moses was feeling, the people watching did not receive a clear view of the God they needed a clear view of. The consequences of that blurring, for a man in Moses' position, were not the same as they would have been for someone in a less critical role. The higher the position between God and the people, the less that position can absorb the overflow of personal anguish. Not because God was punishing Moses for having anguish, but because the role required a clarity that anguish had, in this one moment, prevented. Moses did not argue with the verdict. This is the detail I want to stay with. The man who had argued with God after the golden calf, who had presented 3 consecutive arguments and changed the outcome, who had offered to be blotted out of God's book rather than see the people destroyed, did not argue now. He accepted it. He continued leading. He organized. He interceded. He dealt with the Edomites who refused passage through their territory. He watched Aaron die on Mount Hor, took the priestly garments from Aaron's shoulders and placed them on Aaron's son, Eleazar, and came back down from the mountain without his brother. The text says when the whole community saw that Aaron had died, the entire house of Israel mourned for him 30 days. Aaron was gone. Miriam was gone. The two people who had known Moses longest, who had stood on the other side of the sea and sung with him, who had been in this from before the beginning in ways that no one else in the camp could understand. Both of them buried in the wilderness before the journey ended. Moses kept moving. The people encountered difficulties and turned against Moses and God again. God sent venomous snakes among the camp. People were bitten and died. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." Moses prayed for the people. That sentence sits in the text almost without emphasis. After everything, after the rock and the verdict and Aaron's death and Miriam's death and 40 years of being complained at and questioned and occasionally threatened with stoning. After the verdict, that meant he would not enter the land he had been moving toward his entire adult life. Moses prayed for the people. He was still between. He would always be between. And then the years drew toward their end and Moses began to understand. In whatever way a person understands the approaching of something they cannot stop, that the carrying was almost done, he would not enter the land. God had said so at the rock, and Moses had not argued with it. And the months and years since had not produced any revision of that verdict. The land was ahead. The people were going to get there. Moses was not. He had one more thing to do before the end. He had to stand before the people and say everything he needed them to know. Everything the 40 years had taught him that the next 40 years were going to require of them. Everything he had learned about the God who had spoken to him in fire and who had called the people his treasured possession and who had relented and been patient and been angry and been grieved and had continued. Through all of it, to be present, he was going to have to speak. The man who had once told God he was slow of speech and slow of tongue, who had needed his brother as a voice, who had grown into 40 years of carrying the word back and forth between the mountain and the camp, was going to stand before the entire assembly and speak. He had one more mountain ahead of him. But first, there was something to say. Chapter 12, Deuteronomy. The last words of a man who saw everything. Moses gathered the people, not on a mountain this time, not in the middle of thunder and lightning and fire that the people were too afraid to approach, on the plains of Moab, on flat ground, with the Jordan River visible to the west and the land of Canaan visible beyond it. Open ground, the kind of ground where a very old man can stand in front of a very large crowd and be seen and heard without the mediation of cloud or smoke or the particular terror of Sinai. He was 120 years old. The text will tell us, when it is time to describe his death, that his eyes were not dim and his strength had not left him. But 120 years is 120 years. He had buried his sister and his brother in the wilderness. He had watched the generation that crossed the sea die one by one in the sand over 4 decades. He had received the verdict at the rock and had not argued with it, and had continued leading for the years since without arguing with it. He was still standing. He was still between, but he was at the end of his standing, and he had things to say. What Moses said on the plains of Moab is preserved in the book of Deuteronomy, which in the Hebrew tradition is called Devarim, meaning words. Simply, words. The book whose name is just that word, because that is what it is. The words of Moses at the end of everything, spoken to a people who were about to go somewhere he could not follow. In the last stretch of time he had left to give them what 40 years of wilderness had taught him. Why did he do it? The people he was speaking to were not the people who had come out of Egypt. That generation was gone, dead in the wilderness, as God had said they would be after the failure of the spies. The people standing on the plains of Moab were the children, the ones who had been born in the wilderness, or had been young enough when they left Egypt, that their memories of it were the memories of children rather than adults. They had grown up under the cloud and the fire. They had eaten manna their entire lives. They had never made bricks for a pharaoh, and they had never stood on the far shore of a sea and sung. They knew the story, but they did not have the story in their bodies the way the generation of the Exodus had it in theirs. And Moses was about to leave them. Joshua would lead them into the land. Joshua would cross the Jordan with them and fight the battles and navigate the politics of a people claiming territory in a world that was not waiting for them to arrive. Joshua was capable and faithful and had been one of the 2 spies who believed the land could be taken. Moses had chosen well. But Joshua could not give them what Moses could give them in this moment. Joshua had not been on the mountain. Joshua had not argued with God after the golden calf. Joshua had not stood before Pharaoh 9 times and come back for the 10th. Only Moses could give them this. So he spoke. He did not begin with new information. He began with the story they already knew. He told them where they had come from and what God had done for them and what they had done in response. The good and the terrible and the ordinary. He told them about Horeb and the plagues and the sea and the wilderness, about the golden calf and the intercession and the renewed covenant, about the spies and the verdict and the 40 years of dying. He told them all of it. Not because they did not know it. They knew it. They had heard these stories their whole lives, in the camps at night, from the elders who remembered, in the annual observances of Passover that had been kept even in the wilderness. They knew the outline, but Moses was not giving them the outline. He was giving them his reading of it, the interpretation of a man who had been at the center of every moment he was describing, who had felt the weight of each turning point from the inside, rather than hearing about it from someone who was told by someone who was there. He said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." These words, in Hebrew, became the Shema, the central declaration of Jewish faith, the prayer that has been spoken by Jewish communities every morning and every evening for thousands of years, the words that Jewish men and women have whispered on their deathbeds across every century and every country where Jewish people have lived and died. Moses spoke them on the plains of Moab to a generation that was about to cross a river. He was not composing liturgy. He was telling them the most essential thing he knew, the thing that the burning bush and Sinai and the golden calf and the rock and 40 years in the wilderness had all been teaching him in different registers, that the God who had done all of this for them was not a God among other gods who had simply proven more powerful than the gods of Egypt. He was one. There was no other. And the appropriate response to that reality was not merely obedience or observance or the correct performance of ritual. It was love, with everything, all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. Moses had spent his life trying to help a people understand what it meant to be in relationship with this God. He had carried their complaints and interceded for their lives and stood between them and the consequences of their own failures more times than the text records. He had done all of that because the relationship was real and mattered and could not be reduced to a transaction or a set of regulations that, if properly followed, would guarantee a favorable outcome. The relationship was the point. "And you shall teach these things to your children," Moses said. "You shall talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. You shall write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates." Not only in the tent of meeting, not only on the holy days, at home, on the road, when you lie down, when you get up, in the ordinary movements of ordinary days, in the fabric of daily life rather than only in the moments of designated holiness. Moses understood something that the wilderness had taken 40 years to teach him. The people were not going to face another Red Sea. They were not going to have another Sinai. They were not going to have a burning bush or a pillar of fire or the direct voice of God in thunder on a mountain. They were going to have Canaan, with its complexity and its competing religious systems and its daily demands and its normalcy. They were going to have children who had not seen any of the things Moses had seen. and those children would have children of their own, and the distance from Egypt would grow with every generation. The only way the covenant survived that distance was if it was woven into the texture of daily life, rather than reserved for extraordinary moments. He knew something else. 2. Something harder. He told them, "When you have eaten and are satisfied," he said, "be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws and his decrees that I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Be careful that you do not forget." This is Moses telling them the future, not as prophecy in the formal sense, not in the language of visions or divine revelation delivered in fire, as the simple, clear-eyed observation of a man who had watched the same people fail the same way multiple times across 40 years and had learned to recognize the pattern. Prosperity does not produce gratitude. Abundance does not produce remembrance. When the manna stops and the harvest comes and the houses are built and the flocks are multiplying, the instinct is to believe that all of this is the result of your own effort and intelligence and inherent worthiness, rather than the provision of the God who brought you out with an outstretched arm. Moses knew they were going to forget. He said so directly. He told them that he knew after his death they would become completely corrupt and turn from the way he had commanded them, and disaster would come on them in later days because they would do evil in the sight of the Lord. He knew, and he stood there and gave them the law anyway. He blessed them anyway. He appointed Joshua in front of all of them and gave Joshua his authority and his commission. He wrote down the law and gave it to the priests and commanded that it be read to all the people every 7 years, in the year of canceling debts, so that the words would be heard by every man and woman and child, even the foreigner living in their towns, so that they would hear and learn to fear the Lord your God and follow carefully all the words of this law. He was thinking past his own death, past Joshua, past the generation standing in front of him. He was organizing a system of transmission that would carry what he had learned and received and preserved across time into generations he would not live to see, among people who would be born long after the plains of Moab were only a place in a story. He was building a vessel for the future. The same instinct that had made Jochebed seal a basket against the current of the Nile was alive in her son, standing on the plains of Moab, sealing the law against the current of time. And then Moses stopped speaking. He blessed the tribes of Israel, each one, in the formal language of a man who understands that words spoken at the end of a life carry a weight that words spoken in the middle of it do not. He called them by name. He spoke over each of them something that named who they were and what they were moving toward. And then there was nothing left to say. God told Moses to go up to Mount Nebo and look at the land of Canaan, which he was giving to the Israelites as their possession. You will see it, God said, but you will not cross over into it. Moses had known this was coming. He had known since the rock. He had not argued about it since the rock. He had continued for the years since, as if the verdict were simply one more fact about his life, neither dwelt on nor pretended away. Now it was time. He had said everything he could say. He had given them everything he had received, and everything he had learned, and everything he had held together through 40 years of wilderness by the force of his own intercession and the stubbornness of a man who had said, "Here I am," discovered that those words did not allow for partial commitment. He had blessed them. He had given them Joshua. He had given them the law. He had given them the Shema. The last thing Moses gave the people on the plains of Moab was his absence. He turned and walked toward the mountain, and the people watched him go. Chapter 13. Nebo. The view, the silence, and the question that remains. Moses climbed the mountain alone. No Aaron beside him this time. Aaron had died on Mount Hor, with Moses removing the priestly garments from his brother's shoulders and placing them on Eleazar before coming back down without him. No Miriam singing somewhere in the camp below. No Joshua at his side. No elders waiting at a respectful distance. No pillar of cloud descending to mark the moment with visible drama. Just a man and a mountain and the particular silence of a person who has finished saying everything they needed to say. He climbed to the top of Pisgah, which is the peak of Nebo, across from Jericho, and there, on that summit, God showed him the land. The text describes what Moses saw with a geographic specificity that is unusual even for a narrative that tends to be precise about place names. Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. He could see all of it, 120 years old, and his eyes were not dim. He had been carrying the promise of this land since the burning bush. When God had told him he was sending him to bring the Israelites out of Egypt and into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. He had spoken about it to Pharaoh as the destination. He had described it to the people in the wilderness during the years when it was so distant that describing it required a kind of faith that the desert made very difficult to maintain. He had sent 12 men to see it, and had watched 10 of them come back with a report that cost an entire generation their chance to enter it. He had been talking about this land for 40 years, and now he was looking at it. God said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. I have let you see it with your eyes." There is something in that sentence that requires careful attention. God did not simply allow Moses to die on this mountain without ever seeing the land. God brought Moses to the specific summit from which the land was visible. God gave Moses clear eyes at 120 years old. God arranged the circumstances so that the man who would not cross over would nevertheless see. This was not a consolation prize. It was something more specific than that, and something harder to categorize. The sight was real. The land was real. The seeing was not a substitution for entering. Moses knew the difference between seeing and entering better than anyone. Having spent 40 years navigating the distance between what was promised and what was present, between what God had said would happen and the slow, costly, human-scaled process of it actually happening. He saw the land. And then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab. As the Lord had said, God buried him in a valley in Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. No one knows where his grave is. That detail has been noticed by every serious reader of the text since it was first written. It is not an oversight. It is not the result of poor record-keeping or the loss of information across the centuries. The text tells us explicitly that the location of Moses' grave is unknown, which implies that the unknown quality of it is itself significant enough to record. Why would God bury Moses in a place that no one would find? There are various readings of this across the traditions. Some have suggested that an unmarked grave prevented the site from becoming an object of veneration, that the people who had built a golden calf and demonstrated their capacity to attach their devotion to physical objects might have made a shrine of Moses' burial place that would have distorted both the man and the message he carried. Others have read it as a final expression of the mystery that surrounded Moses' entire relationship with God, that the man who had been shown the divine glory from the cleft of a rock and had come down with his face shining so brightly that the people could not look at him, should have an ending that pointed beyond itself rather than settling into the kind of fixed historical marker that becomes more about the marker than about what the marker marks. Whatever the reason, the effect is this: there is no grave to visit. There is no place to go and stand and say, "Here is where Moses was," the man who led Israel out of Egypt, who received the law on Sinai, who argued with God and changed the outcome, who struck a rock and paid for it with the land he had been working toward for 40 years, who stood on a mountain and saw the promise with his own eyes and then died there. That man has no address. He is present everywhere the words he carried are spoken. He is present nowhere you can mark on a map. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the time of weeping and mourning was over, and they crossed the Jordan. They crossed. Moses did not. Now we have arrived back at the beginning of this story. At the hook, at the old man on the mountain. But now we know everything we did not know when we first saw him standing there. We know the basket and the river and the palace. We know the Egyptian in the sand, and the flight to Midian, and the well and Jethro's daughter, and 40 years of sheep. We know the burning bush, and the 5 refusals, and the long walk back to Egypt. We know Pharaoh and the plagues, and the Passover night, and the bones of Joseph, and the sea that moved. We know Sinai and the law and the 40 days on the mountain and what was happening in the camp while Moses was on the mountain. We know the golden calf and the smashed tablets and the intercession and blot me out. We know the wilderness and Jethro's advice, and the manna that became monotonous, and the spies and the grasshoppers and falling face down in front of the whole assembly. We know Miriam dying in a single sentence, and Aaron dying on a mountain, and Moses taking the garments from his brother's body. We know the rock and the striking, and you will not bring this community into the land. We know all of it. And so, the question that the beginning of this story posed can now be held with the full weight of everything between the question and this moment. What does it mean to be chosen for something you cannot complete, trusted with something you cannot keep, and loved by someone who will still say no? Moses was chosen to bring the people out of Egypt. He completed that. He was chosen to receive the law and transmit it to the people. He completed that. He was chosen to intercede for a people who kept breaking the covenant he was carrying. He completed that. Again and again. Until the wilderness years were done, and the generation that had refused to enter the land had all died, and the next generation was standing on the plains of Moab, listening to everything he had to say. But he was not the one who completed the journey. He brought them to the edge. Joshua took them across. And Moses, who had been standing between things his entire life, stood at the last threshold and did not cross it. Was that a failure? The text does not call it a failure. The text calls Moses the servant of the Lord, the phrase used for the highest commendation available in the biblical vocabulary of honor. The text says that since then no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. No prophet like Moses has risen since then. That is not the epitaph of a man who failed. But it is also not the complete picture of what Moses' life was. Because the man who spoke with God face to face, the man whom the Lord knew face to face, was also the man who stood on a mountain and saw the land and did not enter it. The most intimate relationship with God that the biblical narrative records did not exempt Moses from the consequences of what he did at the rock. It did not guarantee him the outcome he wanted most. It did not convert his 40 years of faithful and costly service into a pass that would allow him to cross the Jordan with the people he had carried to its edge. This is the thing that does not resolve cleanly, and the text does not try to make it resolve cleanly. The intimacy was real. The no was real. Both things were real at the same time. What does it mean to be loved by someone who will still say no? I do not think the answer is that the love was insufficient. I do not think Moses, standing on Mount Nebo with his clear eyes on the land he would not enter, believed the love was insufficient. The man who had spent 40 years as a conduit for that love, who had channeled it toward a broken and difficult and persistently faithless people, who had argued with it and been shaped by it and been sustained by it through losses that would have undone most people, knew what the love was. He knew the love was not in question. What was in question, what the mountain forced into the open, was something harder. Whether the love of God and the will of God and the promises of God would remain real and operative and aimed at their intended destination, even when the person who had been the primary instrument of all of those things was no longer present to carry them. Whether the story was larger than the man. And the answer that Moses saw from the top of Mount Nebo, with his clear eyes on the land of Canaan, was yes. He had been the instrument. He was not the destination. The land was the destination. The people were the destination. The covenant and the law and the relationship between this God and this people, that was the destination. Moses was the man God had chosen to move all of those things from Egypt to the edge of the Jordan River. He had done that. The carrying was not the point. What was being carried was the point, and it was going to keep moving after him. For the Christian reader of this story, there is one more mountain. Centuries after Moses died on Nebo, a man from Nazareth took 3 of his disciples up a high mountain. And there, the gospel accounts say, he was transfigured before them, his face shining like the sun, his clothes becoming white as light, and 2 figures appeared beside him, talking with him. One of them was Elijah, the other was Moses, the man who died outside the land, whose grave no one has ever found, whose bones were not carried by anyone, the way he had carried the bones of Joseph, appeared on a mountain in the land he had not been permitted to enter, and spoke with the one that all of Moses's 40 years between God and the people had been, in ways Moses could not have fully understood while he was living them, pointing toward. He was standing in the land he had seen from Nebo, the land he had carried other people toward for 40 years without being permitted to enter it himself. He was standing in it. For Christian readers, that appearance carries a resonance that is almost too quiet to hold directly. The story did not end on Nebo. The man who had spent his life standing between worlds was still standing between worlds. But the worlds between which he stood had changed. He was no longer standing between Egypt and Canaan, between God's anger and the people's survival, between the mountain and the camp. He was standing in a conversation that the text does not record the content of, on a mountain in the land, in the presence of the one toward whom the whole long arc of his life had been bending. We do not know what they said. We know they were there, and Moses, who had no grave, was standing on ground. There is no grave. We established that at the end of the last chapter, but it is worth beginning here too, because it is the most unusual thing about the end of Moses's life, and because unusual endings tend to reveal something essential about the life they conclude. Every significant figure in the patriarchal narratives of Genesis left a grave. Abraham bought the cave of Machpelah from the Hittites, with a formal transaction recorded in enough detail that we know the price and the witnesses and the legal process by which the purchase was completed. Jacob made his sons swear with their hands under his thigh that they would carry his bones out of Egypt and bury him with his fathers. And they did. Joseph made the same request, and Moses himself had honored it, carrying Joseph's bones out of Egypt on the night of the Passover. These were not sentimental acts. In the ancient world, the grave was the evidence that a person had existed, that their life had been real and located and particular, that they had occupied a specific piece of the earth and been returned to it in a way that could be acknowledged and visited and stood beside by the people who came after. Moses has none of that. What he has instead is words. 5 books of them. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, bears his name in the tradition that has preserved it. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the account of creation and the flood and the patriarchs and the descent into Egypt and the plagues and the sea and Sinai and the wilderness and the plains of Moab. The law and the covenant, and the detailed instructions for how a people who had been slaves were supposed to live as free people in relationship with the God who had brought them out. All of it preserved. All of it carried forward. Billions of people across Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions still carry stories and scriptures in which Moses remains one of the most central figures in human memory. Not because Moses was the most talented person who ever lived, or the most disciplined, or the most naturally suited to leadership. He was, by his own repeated testimony, none of those things. He was slow of speech and slow of tongue. He needed a voice. He tried 5 times to get out of the commission. He struck a rock when he was supposed to speak to it and lost his chance to enter the land he had been working toward for 40 years. He was not the obvious choice. He was the chosen one, which is a different category entirely. This is one of the most consequential lives in all of recorded human memory. Not because of what Moses built, because of what he carried. And the life that was built from that choosing. The life that moved from a basket on the Nile through a palace and a desert and a burning bush and Pharaoh and the sea and Sinai and the wilderness and the rock and the plains of Moab and the top of Mount Nebo. That life left behind something that no grave could ever have held. A direction, a people, a law, a covenant, and a question. The question that this story has been circling since the old man stood on the mountain at the beginning, and we did not yet know who he was or how he had come to be standing there. The question that the burning bush raised and the golden calf raised and the rock raised and the top of Mount Nebo raised in its final and most distilled form. What does it mean to be chosen for something you cannot complete, trusted with something you cannot keep, and loved by someone who will still say no? The life of Moses does not answer that question so much as it demonstrates what it looks like to live inside it without being destroyed by it. Moses was not destroyed by the no at the rock. He was not destroyed by the grumbling in the wilderness or the golden calf or the spies or the 30 years of deaths in the sand or the death of Miriam in a single sentence or the death of Aaron on a mountain with Moses removing the garments from his body. He was not destroyed by any of it. He was worn. He was grieved. He fell on his face more than once and prayed to die more than once and struck the rock in anger once when he had been told to speak to it. He was human in all of those ways. Fully, completely, without reduction. And he kept going. Not because he had found a way to make the no hurt less. Not because he had developed a framework that made the loss of Canaan feel acceptable. But because the thing he had been standing between, the relationship between this God and this people, was real in a way that his personal disappointment, however deep, could not cancel. He had been inside that relationship from the burning bush. He had seen it from the inside. Its patience and its anger and its grief and its faithfulness and the way it kept bending back toward the people, even when the people kept bending away from it. He had been the instrument through which that bending had happened. The human point of mediation through which the divine will had moved into the human world and the human need had moved back toward the divine presence. He knew what the relationship was, and knowing what it was, he could not pretend that his own exclusion from the land diminished it. The relationship was not about him. He was in the service of something larger than his own story. And the something larger was continuing. Moses died on the mountain knowing that it was continuing. Now consider what the text says about Moses that it says about no one else in the Hebrew Bible. Not Abraham, who was called the friend of God. Not David, who was called a man after God's own heart. Not Elijah, who also did not die in the ordinary sense. Only Moses. The Lord knew Moses face to face. Not Moses knew the Lord. The Lord knew Moses. The direction of the knowing matters. In the biblical tradition, to be known by God is not a metaphor for God having information about you. It is the language of intimate relational knowledge, the kind of knowing that involves genuine attention and genuine regard, and genuine engagement with the particularity of a specific person. God knew Moses face to face the way you know someone you have been in conversation with across a long and genuine and costly relationship. The way you know someone whose face you have looked at in the moments when they were not performing for an audience. When they were afraid, or exhausted, or grieved, or angry, or at the end of their capacity. God knew Moses face to face. And the man who was known that way was also the man who struck the rock and did not enter the land. Both things were true. The intimacy did not produce exemption. The knowing did not produce immunity from consequence. The face-to-face relationship between Moses and the God he had spent his life mediating between was not a transaction that paid for his passage into Canaan. It was something else, something that the language of transaction cannot hold. It was a relationship, and relationships, real ones, the kind that involved genuine knowing and genuine love and genuine cost on both sides, do not follow the logic of transaction. They follow the logic of presence, of accompaniment, of the particular faithfulness that shows up again and again, not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because the relationship is real and the person on the other side of it is real, and that reality is not conditional on favorable outcomes. Moses knew that. He had learned it at the burning bush. He had deepened it at Sinai. He had tested it at the golden calf and after the rock, and in the long years of the wilderness, when the only thing that was consistent was that God was present and the people were difficult and Moses was between them. He knew what the relationship was. He climbed the mountain. He saw the land. He died there, with God beside him, in a valley whose location no one knows. And the words he left behind, the words he had been slow to speak at the burning bush, and had learned to speak across 80 years of Here I Am. Those words went across the Jordan with the people. The bones of Joseph made the crossing. The law made the crossing. The Shema made the crossing. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Moses did not make the crossing. He had already done something harder. He had crossed every other threshold that the story required of him. From the basket to the palace, to the desert, to the burning bush, to Pharaoh, to the sea, to the mountain, to the wilderness, to the rock, to the plains of Moab, to the top of Nebo. He had crossed every threshold that the story put in front of him. The Jordan was not his to cross. It was theirs. He had brought them there. That was the work. That was always the work. The man between worlds had stood between the world that was ending and the world that was beginning. The way he had always stood between things. And he had held the space open long enough for the people to move through it. And then he stepped back. And they went. And the words went with them. And the words are still going.